welcome to a new video. Today we'll be making a stretchy corset, which is slightly inspired by Dua Lipa's Met Gala outfit. There will be a pattern available for this corset, which will be linked in the description. It comes in sizes 4 to 24, but please just see the size charts to figure out what size you are, and if you are in between sizes, I'd suggest you go a size smaller. But since we are working with stretchy fabrics, it'll be good either way. Additionally, this pattern comes in a petite, standard, and tall version, so you really should be able to get a corset that fits your body really well, with only a few minor adjustments needed, if even necessary. And as always, if you do follow one of my tutorials, please share the results with me on Instagram. My handle will be somewhere on the screen. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me either here in the comments, on Instagram, or wherever else you see fit. So yeah, let's get started. When you open up your PDF pattern, the first 2 pages will have basic information about the pattern, such as size chart, seam allowance, and any fabric requirements. The first page has information in centimeters and the second in inches. As a bonus, if you're using Adobe Reader, in layers you can deselect any size you don't want to print out. Here I am deselecting all sizes except for size 12, which is the size I will be making my corset in. Before printing out the entire pattern, print out the information page with your preferred measurements. If your printer settings are correct, the box on the page should measure 5 centimeters for people using the metric system or 2 inches for people using the imperial system. If your box is slightly off, try out different scaling settings on your printer until you get the correct measurements. It is also important to select the correct paper size. I am using A4, but the pattern fits on both A4 and US letter, so make sure this is configured correctly as well. When your printer is correctly configured, go ahead and print out the entire pattern. When it comes to assembling the PDF pattern, if needed, adjust the paper size by cutting excess paper off at the dashed lines. Afterwards, it should be possible to match the numbers in the squares and hexagons with each other for each page to assemble the pattern correctly. Once the pattern is assembled, cut out each pattern piece in your size. Here is an overview of the pattern pieces that you should have after completing this step. Alright, now that we have our pattern pieces cut out, I just quickly want to talk about fabric. For this project, I am using a white jersey fabric for my corset, and I am using a black jersey fabric for my binding. I have 1/2 meter of the fabric that is for my corset, and then I have 1/4 meter of the fabric that is for my binding. But any information on fabric requirements can also be found in the pattern information. So now I think it's time to just cut out our fabric. When placing the pattern pieces, make sure the arrow runs parallel to the edge of the fabric, and when cutting out the fabric, check each pattern piece to see how many pieces to cut out. Additionally, the back and binding pieces should be cut on folds, so make sure you place those pieces on the fold of your fabric. If you're using fabric with a clear right and wrong side, make sure you end up with mirrored front pieces. The pattern pieces should look like this when the right side is facing you. After cutting out all our pattern pieces, it's time to sew them all together. So starting from the middle, put the pattern pieces right sides together and sew along the edge. As the first step, we are focusing on our front pieces, which we will sew together with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. As we are working with stretchy fabric, I am sewing with a walking foot, but a normal pressing foot will be fine as well. When you reach the side pieces, they can be a little more difficult to match due to the curves, so take your time to match the edges and use pins or clips. You're also supposed to have this little flap after matching curvy edges. The 2 pieces should cross each other right at your seam allowance. When the front pieces are all sewn together, trim the seam allowance, but be careful not to cut into the stitch line, and then iron the seam allowance open. Alright, so small disclaimer, the hardest part about the corset is going to be the casing. And it's hard because the casing and the top stitches need to be very straight for it to look good. Now I do have some tips so that you can overcome these difficulties, but you can also just choose to skip the casing altogether, and the seams of the corset will still give your top that corset look. But my 3 tips for sewing on the casing are as follows. 1. Make sure you pin the casing on straight. 2. When you top stitch the casing to the corset, use a zipper foot because this will allow you to get really close to the edge of the casing. And 3. Go very slow. The top stitch work you do on the corsets is gonna be visible, so it's very important that you sew very straight and very even, which will make it look better. So yeah, good luck. The next step is to prepare the casing for the corset. To do this, take your casing pieces, fold them in half and sew along the edges with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. After sewing, trim the seam allowance and iron it open with the seam going down the middle of the casing. With this done, we can turn the casing inside out, which I am using my loop turner for, but you can use any method you prefer. Once inside out, you can iron the casing again, making sure the seam is in the middle of the casing. Do these same steps for all the casing pieces, and then we're ready to sew them to the corset. Using the seam on the corset as a guide, match up the middle of the casing seam with the seam of the corset and pin the casing in place. It is okay to have casing hanging over the edges. We will cut this off later. When this is done, sew as close to the edge of the casing as possible on each side to secure the casing to the corset. Remember to follow the tips I mentioned earlier for the best results. When the casings are sewn on, cut off the excess casing and take your back piece and put it right sides together with the front piece to assemble the corset. Sew along the side seams and shoulder seams. After assembling your corset, it's finally time to try it on to check the fit, and I'm wearing my corset here and I think the fit is pretty good. So I'm not going to make any changes to it. But if you do have some fit issues and you need to make some changes, I suggest you start by making the changes in the side seams. And if that doesn't help with your issues, you might need to take the casing off for these two seams right here and adjust the seams here to get some more shape into your garment. But once your corset fits the way you want it to, you are ready for the next step, which is attaching binding to the raw edges of the corset, and then we're actually done. To attach the binding, take one of your binding pieces and match it up right sides together with the edge you're hemming. Fold the edge of the binding towards you to ensure a clean edge on the outside of the garment. Pin along the edge to secure the binding and sew along the edge with a seam allowance of 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch. When you reach the end of the binding strip, sew an overlap of the edges and cut off any excess binding. When that is sewn in place, you fold the binding in half so it touches the seam allowance and then fold it once more so it covers the seam allowance. When sewing around, make sure to sew inside the stitch that was used to place the binding in the first place. That way your stitches won't be visible from the outside of the garment. It is okay to stretch the binding towards the stitch, but don't stretch it along the edge. When you reach the place where the two binding pieces meet, treat them as one piece and fold them in together. When first attaching the binding to the corset, you can use a normal presser foot, but when we fold it over, I recommend using the zipper foot again to get close to the edge of the binding. And there you have it. This is the final result. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to share your results with me if you decide to make this. Thanks a lot. See you in the next one.